I'm Gabe. Kim, do you want to just quickly say hi and introduce
Hi,
yourself?
everyone. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, and so we're here another Friday. Going to talk about our book, but more specifically, um, we're choosing chapters of the book, basically to talk about. Hey, Ro, to talk about and just to promote the book, but also to engage in practices and inquiries that are hopefully valuable to you real time right now. So that's the intention. And today, the inquiry is going to be on the mind of compassion. And so the first Facebook Live we did was really looking at the body and the physiology of just difficult conversations and what's happening for ourselves and how important it is to attend to our body. And the second Facebook Live we did, we talked about intention. Kim led us through that. And one of the taglines that she shared was intention guides attention, right? So that comes from one of Diane's teachings, which we've incorporated into our work in this book as well. And I should say, Diane Wishel-Hamilton is our other co-author and teacher on the Zen and facilitation side of the street. And so today we figured we'd go to the mind, the person or the self that's making sense of the world, and how sometimes that sense making creates conflict and maybe creates suffering, and how to orient in a productive way to when conflict or suffering arises. Kim, in terms of the tech, before we dive in, is there anything that you want to say technically or even about the content?
No, I think we're all clear on the tech.
All right,
Third time's the charm. We've got it smooth, and yeah, let's get into it.
let's dive in. So I want to frame a couple of things so that this all makes sense and you can think about it in meaningful ways in your contexts. Number one, we're departing from a developmental view on the human being, meaning that we grow developmentally through our lifespan, right? And the growth of human beings is super evident when we're young. So for any of us that have children or have worked with children, which is my case, I was a first grade teacher for a little bit, the growth that human beings are undergoing at those ages is so evident. It's so obvious, right? Just the physical growth is obvious. But the intellectual growth or the ability to perceive things is also growing. And so that's happening through our adulthood as well, right? And I'll just give you a simple like taste of how significant our worldview is and how that evolves. So if you take, I'll just take this glass here. If you take this glass and if you paint it yellow on this side and you rotate it and paint it green on this side, to us, we have the sense that the glass is painted one half green, one half yellow. But if I were to show like a very young human being, like we're talking 3, maybe 4, I've seen it even with 5-year-olds, where I'll show them two sides that are differently colored. And let's say you're the little one and you're looking at the yellow side, I'm looking at the green side. And I ask you as the little one, what side am I looking at? Like what color is my side? When in reality it's green, but because the little one sees yellow, they just assume that the whole thing is yellow, even though you rotated it in front of them and it was green and yellow, right? So literally they can't take your perspective and remember and hold on to the fact that it's painted two sides. So it's significant in the sense that the achievement to take a perspective, someone else's perspective, is a pretty big leap, right? And that all happens at a certain age pretty early on. So those kinds of big changes are still happening as we adult, right? And so what I just want to leave you with is that we all have our worldview, and there's certain things that occur inside of that worldview that we can see, and there's certain things that are left out of our worldview. So hopefully that all makes sense and it's straightforward. And the thing that comes out of that, and this is going to be the take home that we want to just leave you with today, is that every point of view is true. However, every point of view is also partial, right? So your human life, you can interpret and see certain things and make sense of certain things. And there's a lot of truth in how you're doing that and seeing and perceiving, but it's not going to always be the whole truth. In fact, we're just defaulting to the perspective that it's never fully the truth, right? And so what Kim and I wanted to talk to you about today was like the mind of compassion is always orienting from that assumption that everything is true but partial, including your own point of view, which is probably the most important, to assume that your point of view is true but partial. So I'll pause there. And Kim, I'm curious if you have anything to riff on or double down.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a helpful setup for us. I think the only thing that I would add is that when we find ourselves in challenging conversations, when we find ourselves actually engaging in a conflict, there's a great multitude of reasons why, but our attention span when we're under stress or we're holding dear to something that's precious to us, or the other points of view are complex. Sometimes we can become more concentrated and focused in on what we believe our own maybe self-interest or values or goals or needs are. And so that's perfect time for us to engage this practice of like, how can the compassion live in us in those moments where we're under that increased sense of stress, so that we can soften, so that we can become more porous and include more perspectives, which is the mind of compassion that we're talking about today.
Sweet. So as we usually do, I'm going to read from the book. And in listening, the point that we're trying to make is that both when conflict arises and also when suffering or pain arise, it's a moment for us, it's an invitation for us to grow. And this quote will explain that in just a second. Just make sure I orient here to the book. So this is from the chapter called Growing Through Conflict. And here's a quick passage on the sense that when conflict arises, it's an invitation to grow. So conflict is an indication that either side of an argument is pretending to be the whole story. So in other words, we're pretending or we're forgetting that our point of view is partial always, but we're pretending or assuming that it's the whole truth, right? So it's an indication that either side of an argument, conflict, is an indication that either side of an argument is pretending to be the whole story. Robert Keegan, a developmental psychologist and researcher at Harvard University, explains it this way. Conflict is likely the consequence of one or both of us making prior, true, distinct, and whole our partial position or a partial view or point of view. A reminder of our tendency are making assumptions, consciously or unconsciously, that our point of view is the whole truth. And so it's a really beautiful invitation from a compassionate point of view of when conflict arising, it's a moment of like deep curiosity, like, oops, whose point of view or what combination of points of view are pretending to be the whole truth when they're actually not. And it should invite us to get very curious and seek out different points of view, to drop our perspective and seek out different points of view. So that's one frame. And the other frame that I wanted to share, and I'm going to type this into the chat, which is very similar, but from the point of view of compassion, or from point of view of compassion, compassion is always a response to suffering. It arises at the same time suffering does, right? And suffering is simply feedback that we're not perceiving the interdependent whole, right? So let's say Kim does something that upsets me, right? And I'm actually not really keyed into what her intention or her motivation was, but whatever she said to me really hurt me. However, if I like take a step back and think, okay, that was painful, there was suffering there, what am I missing? What's part of the situation that I'm not seeing that if I understood would actually allow me to be more compassionate towards Kim's moves, right? And so it's just always inviting us to take stock of and to create understanding. And where there's understanding, compassion can flow. So I'm just going to type that definition in here to the chat. I'll pause there again. And Kim, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just briefly to say that in a situation like that, it's also safe to assume that the possibility of causing harm to Gabe through my actions or my speech or anything like that also comes maybe from my inability or limitation to perceive, in what impact that would have on him. So it's like we create it together, it's both of our limitation is a strong word, because I actually just think it's part of like our human nature in a way that we only have two eyes out of the front of our head. It's just literally true that we can't see all around us at all times. And so I need that feedback from him. I need to engage with that reality, and for him to share with me the impact of it, of whatever it is that's happening, registering as like, ooh, a bit of a like out on him, so that I can also, learn about, the impact of how I'm showing up. So it's very much a two-way street, and his letting me know that something like that has happened is an invitation for me to broaden my horizons and then include his perspective too, so that we can pave a way going forward.
Awesome. So we have a couple of questions for you, and Kim, I'm wondering if we can, if you could presence those. I don't know if you need to look for them.
Sure. You mean what I shared out in
on Facebook?
Yeah. So maybe before I do, I'll just say quickly that I think as human beings, we can just become habituated to what's familiar. And so we get used to telling stories about our lives and our preferences and the ways that we do things, and just the points of view that we take. And in that way, forgivably, we can become a bit rigid. We can become a bit fixed, because that's a groove that we know. And then as with anything, if you have like more of a familiarity in one domain, then it could be that there's other aspects where you're going to be a bit more stumbly. You're going to be a bit more like that baby deer working out how to walk. And so in this conversation, we want to get curious about what is the broader possible range that we could take, as symbolic of the inclusion of more. So the questions that I'm going to pose are like looking for those edges. The first question is, what in your life are you not willing to engage? So what are the maybe the parts that show up in conversation where you pull back? Or maybe there's some feature in your life where you think to yourself, oh, that always happens, and you bristle. So what is it? What is that you're not willing to engage, that kind of gives you that like backup feeling? The next question is, what is the wisdom in your resistance? Maybe there's something beneath that pattern, a reason why you don't want to turn and face in that direction. Maybe you want to protect something that's important to you, that feels, a little bit vulnerable. Or maybe there's strong self-interest that flows down a certain line, and we've become rigid in thinking that that's the one way of doing things. So there might be a wisdom in your resistance, and when we can find the jewel, find the gem in it, then some of the rest of it that maybe is, I hope this makes sense, can begin to soften a little bit. So we don't need to go and do it sort of on a default, unconscious, I just do it because that's the way I am way, but actually seek to discern. Like, is it necessary actually to put my back up against something, or can I hold precious what is mine to hold and still turn to face it? So that's the question of like, what's the wisdom in your resistance? And follow up to that, I think I have here is, what would you gain by turning wholeheartedly to face it and let it engage you? So say, for example, in what Gabe just put out before, maybe there's a reason why I acted in a certain way, and maybe there's wisdom in my reason for doing so that's unbeknownst to him. But if I can allow myself to hold that truth, know that that's true for me, but then still open to Gabe and be willing to receive the feedback, be willing to receive his point of view, then what would that change for me? You know, what would that allow myself to open up into? And that's where maybe I could grow developmentally by holding more of those truths in at one time.
Totally. Yeah. Um, and we'll just keep riffing for a little bit, Kim, to give people some time to respond. If folks, if you have questions about what we're talking about, it might be challenges that you experience in your own life. I think through this lens of what we're talking about, we'll just maybe engage your questions in terms of what's true, what's partial, what might we be missing, etc. So the heart of the questions, I think, are just pointing to the fact that like if there is pain or suffering in your life, the invitation is, cool, what are you leaving out or what are you neglecting? That's kind of at the heart of the inquiry. Kim, I'm wondering, just in terms of modeling, has there been a time when a perspective was revealed to you, maybe because there was suffering or whatnot, that actually you were, for whatever reason, in the mind space to receive it and actually reshuffled your worldview and consequently reshuffled you? In other words, as Keegan said in the quote that I read, you became fuller, more complex, more whole in that way.
Yeah, for sure. I can actually reference a story, an exchange that I had with Diane,
Okay.
where I was I was staying with her. I remember sitting on the bed at the end of like a long integral facilitator day, and at the time, I think I was really tuning into how much we were losing in terms of the biodiversity of our planet, and it was hurting. Like it was actually causing suffering in me, and I could feel it, and I could feel the tension in my body, and I was despairing because an aspect of me was seeing humanity, human beings, and our development and our needs and our consumption as the enemy. So I was finding myself more critical at that time of like the people around me and the choices that they made. And it was a really unforgiving perspective to take. And especially, and I noticed it was putting me at odds in my, like, I live now in the United States. And so there was just like a lot of evidence around that I was constantly reacting to. And Diane basically said to me, well, she told me about a video that she'd watched, which was it's like a map of the planet, and every time, like it was a history, like a sped up history, and every time 1 million people were born, a little light went off. And so it starts off slow, you know, it starts off really slow, and then the lights start blipping, and you just see like the population is expanding. This is just nature itself, you know, like, and she was like, honey, it's a bacteria, it's like a bacteria bloom, you know, like it's a life force that comes, it finds the resource. I don't remember if these are exact words, but this is how I understood it. It's like it finds the air to breathe, it finds the food to eat, and so it multiplies. That's just what's happening here, you know. And I really took it in, and it really did disrupt my system in the sense that I had become habituated in thinking that there was something wrong, you know. And of course, it's not to say that there isn't something really devastating about all the losses that are going to be endured as we continue to bacteria bloom. But at the same time, it's like human beings are nature too. And that really that was very, very insightful for me. And so it melted away some of that aspect of like the enemy perspective, and instead I could just have like compassion for everything that was happening, including the humans who weren't maybe as in touch with the impacts of their actions. I don't know, I just could feel a greater wholeness. So that's the story I want to share.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a good example in the sense of the compassion is like, oh, I came to awareness of these dynamics and the impact that we're having, and like others aren't aware yet. And in a way, the pain and suffering that we're causing in the planet is becoming a louder and louder signal to wake more and more of us up, would be the frame, you know, that I'm hearing your story. So there's wisdom in there. I see some questions or a comment. So somebody is asking, when the other party is not willing or knows how to skillfully deal with conflict, I'm assuming she means like, what do we do in that context? So if someone's less adept or not great at conflict, Kim, how do we deal? I have some thoughts, and I'm curious if you do too. You want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. The first thought that comes to my mind is from when I was studying conflict, and we were looking at cultural differences and the ways that some people are just more skilled at like navigating people from different cultural backgrounds than others who might not have had as much exposure or practice. And the message that we talked about at the time was this, well, the idea we talked about at the time was the little ship moving further for the big ship, because it is literally harder to steer a big ship, you know, in waters, but a smaller ship, it can move. It's more nimble, it's more agile, you know, like it's a smaller body to against the force. So in that way, we can admit that it's not entirely fair. If you are more developed, if you are more skilled, you might find yourself really practicing out those skills in order to accommodate someone who may not have as much range. And I feel the compassion in that. And it might be the same as like when, and I hope this doesn't sound patronizing, but like a 12-year-old can't expect a 6-year-old to be doing everything that the 12-year-old can. So, but the 12-year-old can learn to make up a game or a conversation that the 6-year-old can engage in because the 12-year-old's been there. They know what that's like. So that's what I would offer out as that. And I know for myself, like one of the reasons why I got into this work is because I found myself so frustrated with my ways and methods of dealing with conflict and challenging conversations. And so now I really hope to be able to look with the eyes of compassion when I'm engaging someone who might not have ever known that conflict resolution transformation is itself a practice, an art, a science. And I hope that I can model a way that actually invites them to come in deeper. And if I do that successfully, I feel like I do that successfully when they ask questions, you know, and when I can pique their curiosity. So that's what I would offer about that. I know it can be very frustrating, Alessandra. Yeah, let us know how that lands with you in the chat. Or Gabe, what thoughts did you have?
I mean, I'll just double down on what you just said. I think from the more practiced you are, in other words, the more work you've done on yourself, particularly in the context of if you're a coach, if you're a facilitator or whatnot, or if you've been in therapy work or whatever, if you just have an interest in your working on yourself. Because you're more practiced, you'll probably have to pick up some of the slack or some of the responsibility for the dynamic more than the people you're engaged with, especially those that aren't practiced. And, you know, just as a good default, we usually have a bias towards advocating for our points of view just from the start. And so for those of us that are willing and able to take more responsibility for the dynamic, you know, receiving actually the other's point of view first might be a good place to start. Because if you give them the experience that they were heard and that you really understood their frustrations or their point of view, that'll actually cause them to relax, literally in terms of their nervous system. So I would just give you that tip of try doing the receiving first and really give them the experience of being heard. And they'll be probably more open to yours at that point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kim, just well, and folks, I think the other thing to do, just in the chat if you want, if there's a point of view that you've come across recently that you actually just totally super disagree with, but it's in your field, maybe you could share it in the chat. And also in doing that, try to see what's true about it, like what's actually true about it. So if you actually can do that, it'd be fun to see you throw in the chat. Kim, your story made me think like you're shifting perspectives, and there was something in Diane's invitation to you, like, yeah, we're just a bacteria. Like for whatever reason, that shifted your perspective and gave you a different interpretation and maybe even some kind of more wholer sense of what's going on. And so I wanted to share just the practice from the book because it's related to when we shift identities, we actually see different things. And so the practice of taking different points of view can be really helpful in creating more space and room in yourself, but also in the conversation that you're in that might be tense. So let me just read this as 4 steps, and we can type this in and put it in the chat when we're done. So think about your last conflict. That's step one. Step two, what identity was most activated in you? For example, were you a parent, a partner, an employer, a friend, right? So you might be in a simple exchange with your toddler, and you're just really feeling your parenthood, and there's a tension there, right? In that identity, right? You being a parent. Number three is there another identity that could have had a role in that conflict? In other words, could there have been a different perspective that you took, that you could have engaged that dynamic from? And then four, how would the conflict have changed if you had shifted to a different identity? So we'll type those into the chat, but that's the practice in the book that we're inviting you to engage. So I see Manu put a comment here. Says today was one of the most difficult conversations we have here in Brazil is to do or not to do a lockdown, right? And there are not shared values or principles that health and life is the most important thing. So there's a stabilized polarization between, right, holding our financial well-being, the economy, and our health and life. And we're not able to move on to create new possibilities. Totally. Manu, so my invitation would be, it sounds like, just based on reading your comment, which is a bias I hold, it seems like your position is in favor of life first, right? So you're putting life ahead of the financial health. So I guess my invitation to you would be to seek perspectives, or to seek the truth of putting the economy ahead of, just our health and life. Like take that as just a yoga, as a practice to do and to engage. And again, we're just trying to create more space in our being and to seek out perspectives. And so that would be the invitation to you if you want to try. Thank you, Kim. So Kim just dropped in the practices from the book. And Kim, I'm wondering if we want to kind of start rounding the bend here, because we've been at this for quite a bit now.
Yeah, sure. I think that maybe something that I would just like to offer is towards the the second part of the second question, like what would we gain from being able to include more of those perspectives and take that compassionate view? So like what's the fruit in this practice that makes it worth our while? Because we acknowledge that it can be frustrating and can sometimes feel against our nature. And I think what I would just say, like from my own life, is that the way in which I experience suffering has shifted from being able to engage practices like these. When Gabe said earlier that the suffering, suffering is feedback, that we're not seeing that larger whole, that we're not including the other, perhaps. I feel more empowered. Like I feel like I have more freedom to do this kind of jujitsu training with my clouds, my own personal clouds of suffering. And it has less of a hold on me. And I think just the final word I would say is that I think it can orient us towards greater freedom. Because when our suffering is not conditioning the way that we step forward into our lives, or the way that we pick ourselves up off the bed every day and go ahead with what we are setting out to do, we just have so much more freedom in how we respond to other people and how we respond to ourselves. When we hear a narrative, or we hear a story, or a way of being arising, we can learn to take a perspective on it. And when we can take a perspective on it, there's a choice about how we live into it. So yeah, I wanted to share that. I think that it can bring us more freedom and more choice.
Totally. Yeah. And I think just my last piece will be back to Manuela, just in the chat, just sitting with your question. Yeah, literally in terms of different points of view to seek, as Kim was just saying, like literally inhabit different people like people that you are aware of. So you can think of the people in like a lower socioeconomic class, take their point of view and try to understand how they hold the polarity between opening or keeping the economy open and or just shutting it down, bring the hammer, lock everything down. How are they making sense of that? How do they see their choices? And as Kem said, just our ability to take different points of view and do this yoga creates more choices. And for more choices, we're assuming, we're holding the position that you can make better decisions that are more in service to the whole, simply because you are doing that exercise to be connected to and make sense of as much as you can. Sweet.
Great. Thank you, everyone who's joined us, or if you're catching the recording afterwards. Thanks for being here. If you have any questions about anything that we've shared, or you have a request for a future topic, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'll be back for next few Fridays, I believe, and hopefully we'll get Diane on with us real soon to share her wisdom and insights, which are always a gift.
Thank you, Kim, as always. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.